In the years leading up to December 7th, 1941, the United States Pacific Fleet, anchored at Pearl Harbor, was more than a collection of warships. It was a symbol. It was a tangible manifestation of American industrial might and a powerful statement of national intent in the face of escalating global tensions. To understand the intelligence failures that nearly led to its destruction, one must first comprehend the powerful and ultimately flawed strategic mindset that governed its deployment and readiness. This was an era defined by a myth of invincibility, a dangerous cocktail of racial prejudice, technological overconfidence, and a fundamental misreading of Japanese strategy and capability. The seeds of a disaster were not planted in the weeks before the attack, but in the years of arrogant assumptions that preceded it. The cornerstone of American strategy in the Pacific was the fleet itself. The decision by President Franklin D. Roosevelt in April 1940 to forward deploy the fleet from its traditional home ports on the U.S. West Coast to the exposed, advanced base at Pearl Harbor was a calculated gamble. The intent was unequivocally political, to deter Japanese aggression in the Pacific, particularly their ongoing war in China and their expansionist dreams for a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Washington believed that the sheer visual presence of America's battle line, its formidable battleships lined up in Battleship Row, would give the imperialists in Tokyo pause. It was a battleship-centric view of naval power, a belief that these colossal vessels were the ultimate arbiters of maritime dominance. This perspective, however, blinded American planners to their own vulnerabilities and, more critically, to the innovative ways a potential adversary might seek to circumvent their perceived strength. This over-reliance on the battleship was coupled with a pervasive and catastrophic racial bias. Throughout the U.S. military and political establishment, there was a widespread belief in the inherent inferiority of the Japanese fighting force. They were often caricatured as a nation of imitators, incapable of genuine innovation or complex strategic thought. A common belief held that the Japanese were physically incapable of being effective pilots due to supposed poor eyesight and a lack of mechanical aptitude. This racist lens distorted every piece of intelligence that came across analyst desks. Reports of Japanese capabilities were often dismissed or downplayed because they did not fit the pre-existing narrative of a technologically backward adversary. The idea that Japan could develop a world-class naval air arm, with highly trained pilots and advanced aircraft like the Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, was considered ludicrous by many. This wasn't just an intelligence failure. It was a failure of imagination, rooted in a hubris that would have devastating consequences. The geographical layout of Pearl Harbor itself was a testament to this misplaced confidence. The harbor was seen as a natural fortress. Its narrow entrance channel was believed to make it immune to submarine attack, and its shallow waters were thought to preclude the use of aerial torpedoes, which required a certain depth to arm and run effectively. American torpedo bombers required deep water for practice. The assumption was that everyone else's did, too. This led to a critical and fatal miscalculation. The fleet's anti-aircraft defenses were on a low state of alert, and the ships were moored closely together, making them ideal targets for a concentrated bombing attack. The primary concern for defense was against sabotage from local Japanese Americans, which is why aircraft were parked wingtip to wingtip in the middle of the airfields, making them perfect, immobile targets for strafing fighters and bombers. They were protecting themselves from the threat they imagined, while remaining utterly exposed to the threat they had dismissed. Furthermore, the American strategic mind was fixated on a different scenario entirely. War Plan Orange, the long-standing blueprint for a potential war with Japan, envisioned a straightforward campaign across the Central Pacific. The consensus was that if war came, the Japanese would first attack American outposts in the Philippines or perhaps Guam. The fleet at Pearl Harbor would then sortie to engage the Imperial Japanese Navy in a decisive, Jutland-style battleship engagement somewhere in the vast expanse of the ocean. The idea of a preemptive, carrier-based aerial strike against the heart of the fleet in its home port was considered a tactical impossibility. The distances involved were too great, the logistics too complex, and the Japanese, according to the prevailing wisdom, simply lacked the skill and audacity to pull it off. This myth of invincibility created a perfect cognitive fortress. Intelligence warnings that contradicted this worldview were not merely questioned. They were filtered out, ignored, or explained away. When cryptanalysts deciphered Japanese diplomatic messages indicating a heightened state of alert and an impending break in relations, the assumption was that this meant an attack in Southeast Asia. When the U.S. Army in Hawaii received a war warning from Washington in late November 1941, it was interpreted through this lens: prepare for sabotage and be ready to execute a deployment to forward bases. The possibility that the fleet itself was the target was the one scenario they had collectively and systematically ruled out. Thus, on the eve of December 7th, the Pacific Fleet slumbered in a harbor that was both its base and its trap. The sailors and commanders were professionals, but they were operating within a system poisoned by unquestioned assumptions. They believed their strength was a deterrent, when in fact, to the Japanese, it presented a target of opportunity. They believed their technology and their geography made them safe, while their enemy was perfecting the very weapons and tactics to exploit their weaknesses. They believed their adversary was inferior, while that adversary was honing one of the most brilliantly executed military operations in history. The stage was not just set for an attack. It was set for a catastrophic surprise, because the defenders, convinced of their own unassailable power, had forgotten the most fundamental rule of war: the enemy has a vote. In the shadowy world of pre-war intelligence, the United States held a seemingly miraculous advantage. They had broken Japan's diplomatic codes. The cipher system, known as Purple, was a complex machine-based code that the Americans had painstakingly reverse-engineered through a brilliant cryptanalytic effort dubbed Magic. This operation provided Washington with a clandestine window into the inner sanctum of Japanese foreign policy, relaying secret communications between the foreign ministry in Tokyo and its embassies around the world. The intelligence flowing from this source in the months and weeks leading up to December 7th was a torrent of ominous indicators, a clear and present warning of impending war. Yet, this flood of critical information did not result in a state of heightened alert at Pearl Harbor. The failure was not in the collection of intelligence, but in its distribution, analysis, and, most fatally, in the preconceived notions that filtered its interpretation. The Magic intercepts painted a picture of a nation preparing for a decisive break. The most crucial set of messages was the so-called east wind rain alert. In early December, Japanese embassies were instructed to listen for a special weather forecast in their shortwave radio broadcasts. The phrase east wind rain was to be embedded within the seemingly innocuous forecast, signaling that diplomatic relations with the United States were to be severed and that war was imminent. American codebreakers were aware of this system and were monitoring the airwaves intently. The very existence of such a clandestine, high-priority warning system was a glaring red flag, indicating that Japan was preparing for actions beyond mere diplomatic posturing. It was a direct signal that the point of no return was approaching. Simultaneously, a stream of encrypted diplomatic traffic was instructing Japanese officials abroad to destroy their code machines and sensitive documents. On December 2nd, a message went out to the consulate in Honolulu, specifically ordering the destruction of all but one of their code machines and their most secret ciphers. To any objective analyst, this was a classic pre-hostilities action, a nation tidying up its clandestine affairs before launching an attack. Why would a consulate in a neutral country need to destroy its most sensitive communications equipment unless that neutrality was about to be violently shattered? This message, like so many others, was decrypted and translated by Magic analysts. Yet, the profound significance of this order, particularly as it was directed at the consulate in Honolulu, the very location of the Pacific Fleet, was lost in the bureaucratic fog of Washington. Perhaps the most poignant and tragic intelligence failure involved the 14-part message. On the night of December 6th and into the early hours of the 7th, American intercept stations picked up a lengthy, encrypted transmission from Tokyo to the Japanese embassy in Washington. This was the Japanese reply to Secretary of State Cordell Hull's recent note, effectively their final diplomatic communication. American codebreakers worked through the night, frantically decrypting and translating the message. The 14th and final part, delivered around 5 a.m. Washington time on December 7th, stated unequivocally that it seemed impossible to reach an agreement through further negotiations. This was a de facto declaration that diplomacy had failed. Even more critically, a separate message instructed the embassy to deliver this 14-part message to the American Secretary of State at precisely 1 p.m. Washington time on that same Sunday. This 1 p.m. deadline was the most specific and actionable piece of intelligence the United States received. Senior Army and Navy officers in Washington, including General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, immediately recognized its potential significance. A specific deadline on a Sunday afternoon? Why the urgency? To several, it suggested the high probability of a military action coordinated to coincide with that time. The question was where? The prevailing assumption, locked in by the myth of invincibility, was Southeast Asia, perhaps an attack on the British in Malaya or the Americans in the Philippines. The possibility of a strike on Pearl Harbor, 13 hours behind Washington time, was considered but quickly dismissed. The machinery of communication, however, then failed completely. General Marshall, deciding against using the telephone for security reasons, composed a final alert message to be sent to all Pacific commands, including Hawaii. It stated, "The Japanese are presenting at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time today what amounts to an ultimatum. Just what significance the hour set may have we do not know, but be on alert accordingly." This vital warning, which might have given the commanders in Hawaii a few hours' notice, was not sent via the fastest means. It was routed through the commercial telegraph system due to poor atmospheric conditions hindering Army radio channels. By a cruel twist of fate, the message was still in the process of being decoded at a commercial office in Honolulu when the first Japanese bombs began to fall. It was delivered to General Walter Short's headquarters by a motorcycle messenger while the attack was underway. The broken code had provided one last desperate clue, and the broken system of response had ensured it arrived too late. The failure to act on the magic intercepts was a systemic catastrophe. The intelligence was fragmented, with different agencies, War Department, Navy Department, State Department, hoarding pieces of the puzzle and failing to share them effectively. There was no central, analytical body to collate the diplomatic intelligence from magic with a military intelligence about Japanese ship movements. But beyond the bureaucracy, the ultimate failure was cognitive. The analysts and commanders read the warnings through the lens of their own assumptions. The messages about destroying codes and setting a 1 p.m. deadline were fitted into the existing narrative of an attack in Southeast Asia. The evidence was there, clear and compelling. But it was filtered through a prism of prejudice and preconception that rendered it impotent. The code was broken, but the mindset needed to understand its true message remained stubbornly, tragically, locked. As the first light of dawn broke over the Hawaiian island of Oahu on December 7th, 1941, a technology that could have rewritten history was already active. It was a new and revolutionary tool, an electronic sentinel capable of seeing over the horizon, radar. That morning, its operators would deliver the final, unambiguous warning of the approaching danger. Their sighting was precise, timely, and represented a last-minute chance to scramble fighters, man anti-aircraft batteries, and sound the alarm that could have saved the Pacific Fleet from its devastating surprise. Yet, this warning was dismissed as a triviality, a ghost on a screen, ignored by a chain of command that was mentally unprepared for the reality it represented. The story of the Opana Point radar is a tragic tale of technological potential strangled by human complacency. In 1941, radar was in its absolute infancy. The U.S. Army had installed 6 mobile radar sets on Oahu as part of a nascent early warning system. They were experimental, temperamental, and their operators were raw recruits from the Signal Corps with only limited training. The standard operating procedure was to run daily training exercises from 4 a.m. to 7 a.m., after which the stations would shut down for the day. This schedule was based on the prevailing military wisdom of the time. A dawn attack was considered highly unlikely due to the perceived difficulty of navigation and coordination for an enemy force. The very operating hours of this critical defense system were dictated by an assumption of the enemy's limitations, a fatal misjudgment that would seed the morning sky. At the Opana Mobile radar station located on the northern tip of Oahu, two privates, Joseph Lockhart and George Elliott, were manning the SCR-270 radar set. Lockhart was the more experienced operator, and he was coaching Elliott. At 7:02 a.m., well past the official closing time of 7 a.m., Elliott asked if they could keep the set running for a few more minutes so he could get some extra practice. Lockhart agreed. It was this simple, almost casual decision that provided the United States with its first concrete sighting of the attack force. At 7:06 a.m., the oscilloscope screen, which had been clear, suddenly bloomed with a massive and unprecedented signal. It was so large and distinct that Lockhart initially thought the equipment was malfunctioning. He checked and rechecked the connections. The signal remained, a pulsating electronic echo of the greatest naval air armada ever launched. The two privates tracked the blip with growing alarm. It was approximately 137 miles north of Oahu and moving steadily southward directly toward the island. The size of the signal suggested a large number of aircraft, perhaps 50 or more. They continued tracking the contact until it was about 22 miles away, at which point ground clutter from the island's mountains began to obscure the signal. At 7:20 a.m., Lockhart decided they had to report this. He phoned the Fort Shafter Information Center, the nerve center responsible for processing such warnings. The operator on duty, a young lieutenant named Kermit Tyler, took the call. Lockhart, with a sense of urgency, reported a large number of planes coming in from the north, 3 points east. The response from the other end of the line was a moment of breathtaking, history-altering complacency. Lieutenant Tyler's mind did not jump to the possibility of a Japanese attack. Instead, he recalled a conversation from the previous evening. He knew that a flight of American B-17 Flying Fortress bombers was scheduled to arrive from the mainland that morning, approaching from the northeast. He also knew that the Navy often flew patrols from its aircraft carriers, and that the pilots frequently did not turn their IFF, identification friend or foe, transponders on. To Tyler, the simplest and most logical explanation was that the large blip on the radar screen was this expected flight of B-17s. He famously told the radar operators, "Well, don't worry about it." The two privates, low-ranking soldiers with no authority to challenge an officer's judgment, reluctantly shut down their equipment at 7:40 a.m. and headed for breakfast. The Japanese first wave was now less than 30 miles from Oahu, its pilots donning their hachimaki headbands. The failure at the information center was multifaceted. The center itself was understaffed and operating at a low state of readiness. The plotting tables, meant to track incoming aircraft, were not fully manned. More importantly, there was a complete breakdown in the conceptual understanding of the threat. Lieutenant Tyler was an airman, not a radar specialist. He was operating with a critical piece of information, the expected B-17 flight, but lacked the context or the training to question his own assumption. No one had ever trained him on what to do with a report of a massive, unidentified air formation. The established procedure was to dispatch fighter planes to visually identify any unknown contacts. This was not done. The idea that it could be a hostile force was so alien, so contrary to the entrenched myth of invincibility, that it was dismissed out of hand. The Opana Point sighting was not an isolated ghost. Other radar stations on the island had also detected the first wave that morning before shutting down at 7 a.m., but their operators had dismissed the signals as anomalies or interference. The Opana contact was the only one reported, and it was the only one that could have made a difference. Had the information center been fully operational and mentally prepared for war, the 1-hour warning provided by Privates Lockhart and Elliott could have been transformative. Fighters could have been scrambled, battleship crews could have been ordered to battle stations, and anti-aircraft shells could have been stacked and ready. The fleet would not have been caught with its boilers cold and its ammunition locked away. The radar, the technological marvel, had functioned perfectly. It was the human element in the chain of command, the assumptions, the inexperience, the rigid adherence to peacetime routines that failed. The ghost on the screen was all too real, and its warning died in the static of human complacency, just minutes before the skies over Pearl Harbor erupted in fire and steel. In the intricate tapestry of military preparedness, reconnaissance is the essential thread that binds strategy to reality. It is the act of seeing the enemy before the enemy sees you, of turning the unknown into the known. For a naval base as vital and exposed as Pearl Harbor, a comprehensive and vigilant reconnaissance patrol regime was not merely a best practice. It was a fundamental prerequisite for survival. Yet, in the critical months and weeks leading up to December 7th, 1941, the skies around Hawaii remained largely unscrutinized by American eyes. This chapter examines the catastrophic failure of reconnaissance. Not a failure of equipment or capability, but a failure of command priority, inter-service rivalry, and a profound misallocation of resources that left the Pacific Fleet blind to the dagger poised at its heart. The primary responsibility for long-range aerial reconnaissance fell to the U.S. Navy, and specifically to the patrol wings of the Pacific Fleet. The tool for this job was the PBY Catalina, a sturdy, long-range flying boat capable of staying aloft for over 15 hours and covering vast stretches of ocean. In theory, a full 360-degree patrol around the Hawaiian Islands was possible. In practice, it was never implemented. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, SINCPAC, and his staff were faced with a severe shortage of resources. They had only 81 PBY Catalinas available, many of which were in need of maintenance or overhaul. To maintain a continuous, full-circle patrol would have required exhausting both men and machines at an unsustainable rate, burning through precious engine hours and leaving no reserve for actual combat operations once war began. This resource constraint, while real, was compounded by a critical strategic choice. Admiral Kimmel and his Army counterpart, Lieutenant General Walter Short, were operating under the war warning dispatch sent from Washington on November 27th. This message explicitly stated, an aggressive move by Japan is expected within the next few days. However, both commanders interpreted this warning through the lens of their pre-existing beliefs. They, like Washington, were fixated on the threat to Southeast Asia. Consequently, Kimmel made a calculated decision to prioritize reconnaissance in the southwest sector toward the Marshall Islands and the likely Japanese approach routes to the Philippines and Malaya. The northern approach, the vast and empty expanse of ocean stretching towards the Kuril Islands, was deemed a low-probability axis of attack. The prevailing wisdom held that the treacherous North Pacific weather in December, with its high seas, dense fogs, and powerful storms, made a large-scale carrier operation from that direction too risky and difficult for the Japanese to attempt. It was a calculated risk, but one based on a flawed assessment of the enemy's skill and audacity. This failure was not the Navy's alone. The U.S. Army Air Forces, under General Short, possessed a significant number of long-range B-17 and B-18 bombers stationed in Hawaii. These aircraft, particularly the B-17 Flying Fortress with its immense range, were perfectly capable of conducting supplementary maritime patrols. Yet, the Army and Navy operated in near-total isolation from one another. The Navy saw the Army's bombers as strategic assets for long-range strikes against land targets, not for naval reconnaissance. The Army, in turn, was solely focused on its own mission, protecting the fleet and the base from air attack by defending the airspace over Oahu itself. This myopic focus led to the infamous decision to cluster all the Army's fighter and bomber aircraft wingtip to wingtip in the middle of their airfields to prevent sabotage, a decision that made them utterly vulnerable to the very air attack they were meant to deter. The concept of using Army bombers to patrol the distant ocean approaches was never seriously considered or coordinated between the two services. It was a staggering failure of joint operations, a product of institutional silos that would have devastating consequences. The most damning illustration of this reconnaissance failure occurred on the very morning of the attack. As the Japanese task force closed to within 200 miles of Oahu, the ocean between them and the island was a complete void to the American defenders. A single, properly directed patrol flight by a PBY Catalina on a northern arc that morning would have almost certainly stumbled upon the 6 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuiku, as they turned into the wind to launch their aircraft. Such a discovery, even if the PBY was shot down immediately after sending its contact report, would have provided at least an hour's warning. That single hour was the difference between surprise and preparedness, between a crippling defeat and a ferocious, costly, but ultimately successful defense. The absence of these critical flights was a choice, not an inevitability. It was the result of a command culture that prioritized conserving resources for an anticipated offensive campaign over ensuring the immediate security of the fleet. It was a failure to correctly interpret strategic warnings and align tactical reconnaissance accordingly. It was a testament to the paralyzing effects of inter-service rivalry and a lack of imaginative command. The Japanese planners, led by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, understood these American blind spots intimately. They bet the entire success of their operation on the predictability of American thinking, on the assumption that the treacherous northern route would be left unpatrolled. They gambled, and they won. The American commanders, constrained by material limitations and, more fatally, by cognitive ones, left the most dangerous door to their house wide open. The missing reconnaissance flights were not just planes that never took off. They were the final, critical link in a chain of failures that allowed the enemy to approach unseen, to deliver a blow that would plunge the United States into a war it was, in that moment, tragically unprepared to fight. In the final, frantic hours before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States military command in Washington possessed the ultimate confirmation that war was imminent. The pieces of the intelligence puzzle had fallen into place with terrifying clarity. The 14-part Japanese diplomatic message had been decrypted, revealing the termination of negotiations. Most critically, the 1 p.m. delivery time had been identified, a specific deadline that screamed of synchronized hostile action. The senior leadership, from President Roosevelt on down, understood that the United States was on the brink. The machinery of warning was finally, belatedly, set in motion. Yet the system designed to transmit this critical alert to the commanders in the field was so plagued by incompetence, indecision, and a catastrophic failure of communication that the message intended to save the Pacific Fleet arrived not as a warning, but as a postmortem. This is the story of the bungled alert, a cascade of small errors that culminated in a historic catastrophe. The drama unfolded in the War Department's message center on the morning of December 7th. General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, arrived at his office and was presented with the final, translated parts of the Japanese message. He immediately grasped its grave significance. The 1 p.m. deadline in Washington was a clear indicator that Japanese military operations were likely to commence at that precise moment, somewhere in the Pacific. A meeting was hastily convened with his naval counterpart, Admiral Harold Stark. The question was not if to send a warning, but how to send it with the utmost speed and security. Stark favored using the secure telephone, but Marshall, demonstrating an excess of caution that would prove fatal, demurred. He was concerned about Japanese eavesdropping on transoceanic phone lines and feared that a clear verbal warning might tip the enemy to the fact that their codes were broken. He made the fateful decision that the warning would be sent by telegram. This decision, rooted in a misplaced sense of communication security, immediately introduced a critical and unnecessary delay. It was now approximately 11:50 a.m. Washington time. The attack was scheduled to begin at 1 p.m. Washington time, which was 7:30 a.m. in Hawaii. Marshall's staff began drafting a message to be sent to all Pacific commands, including General Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines and General Walter Short in Hawaii. The final text of the message was direct and unambiguous. The Japanese are presenting at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time today what amounts to an ultimatum. Just what significance the hour set may have we do not know, but be on alert accordingly. This was the final official alert. It acknowledged the deadline and explicitly ordered a state of readiness. Had it been transmitted instantly, it might have given Hawaii a window of approximately 2.5 hours to prepare. The bureaucratic machinery, however, moved with a peacetime lethargy utterly disconnected from the wartime urgency of the moment. The message was handed to a Signal Corps officer for transmission at around 12:15 p.m. Here, the second critical failure occurred. The officer attempted to send the message via the Army's own radio system, the fastest means available. Due to atmospheric conditions, a common issue at that time of day, the direct radio circuit to Hawaii was experiencing severe interference. Faced with this problem, the officer made a catastrophic choice. Instead of immediately resorting to the secure telephone, which Marshall had earlier rejected, or using the Navy's more robust radio network, he chose to route the message through commercial telegraph lines. This was standard procedure for non-urgent traffic when military channels were down. In a stunning failure of judgment, no one present designated the message with a higher priority that would have forced the use of alternative, faster means. The message was handed over to the Western Union office in Washington. From there, it was transmitted via RCA commercial radio to San Francisco. In San Francisco, it was again transferred, this time to the commercial cable office for the final leg to Honolulu. Each handoff consumed precious minutes. The message, containing the last chance to avert disaster, was now in the hands of a civilian infrastructure, traveling at the speed of a routine business telegram. It arrived at the RCA office in Honolulu at 7:33 a.m. local time, 3 minutes after the attack had officially begun. The final, almost surreal, failure was in the last mile of delivery. There was no system for the immediate priority delivery of such a message to the commanding general. The telegram was placed in a routine dispatch pouch and sent via a motorcycle messenger on a leisurely Sunday morning route through the quiet streets of Honolulu. As the first bombs fell on Battleship Row and the airfields, as smoke and fire engulfed the harbor, the motorcycle messenger carrying General Marshall's warning was wending his way through the chaos. He arrived at General Short's headquarters at Fort Shafter while the attack was still raging. The message was decoded and finally placed on General Short's desk. He read the words ordering him to be on alert, as the sounds of the very attack he was supposed to be preparing for echoed outside his window. The paper in his hand was not an order. It was an indictment. It was a brutal, tangible record of a warning system that had failed at every single level, from the Chief of Staff's excessive caution in Washington, to the Signal Corps officer's rigid adherence to protocol, to the commercial delays of the telegraph system, and finally, to the lack of an emergency delivery protocol in Hawaii. The bungled alert stands as one of the most poignant and frustrating failures of the entire Pearl Harbor disaster. The intelligence had been correctly interpreted at the highest levels. The intent to warn had been genuine, but the execution was a masterpiece of inefficiency. It was a failure born not of malice, but of a peacetime mindset unable to comprehend or adapt to the immediacy of war. The system was too slow, too brittle, and too reliant on routine. The message that was meant to be a shield arrived as a tombstone, a stark testament to the fact that in the modern era of lightning-fast warfare, a warning is only as good as the speed and reliability of the system that delivers it. On December 7th, that system broke down completely, and the price was paid in the lives of 2,403 Americans and the near destruction of the Pacific Fleet. Beneath the specific intelligence lapses, the misrouted messages, and the neglected radar contacts lay the foundational failure that made the attack on Pearl Harbor possible, a profound and systemic underestimation of the Imperial Japanese Empire. This was not merely a tactical miscalculation, but a deep-seated cultural and strategic blindness that permeated the highest levels of American political and military thought. The United States, viewing the world through a lens of Western industrial and racial superiority, consistently misjudged both Japan's technical capability to execute a complex military operation and the sheer depth of its national resolve to risk a war with a sleeping giant. This final failure of imagination created a cognitive firewall that rendered all other warnings inert, ensuring that the most obvious conclusion was the one never drawn. The American assessment of Japanese technological prowess was dismissive to the point of caricature. The pervasive racial stereotype of the Japanese as a nation of imitators, incapable of genuine innovation, directly corrupted military analysis. The idea that Japan could produce a world-class fighter plane was considered absurd. When Claire Chennault, the American advisor to the Chinese Air Force, reported on the exceptional maneuverability and speed of a new Japanese fighter, the now legendary Mitsubishi A6M0, his warnings were officially dismissed by the War Department. American aviation experts insisted that such performance characteristics were impossible given known Japanese engineering, concluding that Chennault must have exaggerated. This willful ignorance extended to Japanese naval aviation. The concept of a massed, coordinated carrier strike, requiring the seamless integration of 6 fleet carriers, their escorts, and hundreds of highly trained pilots, was seen as beyond Japan's operational capacity. The American naval establishment, still somewhat battleship-centric, failed to grasp that the Japanese had not only embraced naval air power, but had perfected it to a degree unmatched by any other nation. This underestimation of capability was inextricably linked to a fatal misreading of Japanese psychology and intent. The American strategic mind, shaped by a rationalist cost-benefit calculus, could not comprehend the Bushido Code and the concept of Yamato Damashii, the Japanese spirit. From the American perspective, a war with the United States was an act of national suicide. The industrial disparity was too vast. America's GDP was nearly 10 times that of Japan. The logical conclusion in Washington was that Tokyo, however belligerent, would ultimately back down when confronted with unambiguous American resolve, as embodied by the forward-deployed Pacific Fleet. What American planners failed to understand was that from the Japanese perspective, their options were either national humiliation through American-led economic sanctions, particularly the oil embargo, or a glorious, if desperate, war for national survival and regional dominance. They chose the latter, not in spite of the odds, but because of them. They believed their superior spirit and what could overcome America's material advantage. This cultural myopia blinded American intelligence to the clear signals of Japan's specific intentions. The meticulous planning of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a man who had studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington, was built upon an intimate understanding of American psychology. He knew the United States would consider an attack on Pearl Harbor to be irrational and therefore impossible. He exploited this assumption perfectly. The concentration of Japanese naval forces for the Pearl Harbor operation was detected in piecemeal, but never correctly assembled into a coherent picture because the picture itself was deemed illogical. Reports of Japanese naval movements and carrier locations were filed away because they did not point toward the obvious targets in Southeast Asia. The very audacity of the plan was its own best camouflage. The failure was also one of mirror imaging. American commanders projected their own limitations and thought processes onto their adversary. The U.S. Navy considered the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor a natural defense against aerial torpedoes, as their own standard torpedoes required deep water to function. The idea that the Japanese could have developed a sophisticated torpedo with wooden stabilizers to run true in shallow water was never seriously entertained. Similarly, the treacherous weather and long supply lines of the Northern Pacific route were seen as an insurmountable barrier for the U.S. Navy, so they were assumed to be a barrier for the Japanese as well. They did not account for the fact that the Japanese had specially trained their crews for high seas, refueling in rough weather, and had developed a rigorous navigation program for just such a mission. The ultimate manifestation of this failure was the consistent belief that any war would begin with a predictable, conventional opening move. The entire U.S. military apparatus was poised for an attack on the Philippines, Guam, or Malaya. The war plans, the disposition of forces, and the interpretation of intelligence were all aligned with this expected scenario. The possibility of a knockout blow against the main battle fleet in its home port was the one contingency for which they were utterly unprepared, because in the American strategic playbook, it made no sense. It was an irrational act by an irrational actor. In the end, the smoldering wreckage in Pearl Harbor was the physical proof of this catastrophic intelligence failure. It was not a failure to collect information, but a failure to understand the enemy that the information described. The United States had gauged Japan by its own measures of capability, logic, and resolve, and found it wanting. But Japan operated on a different set of principles, driven by a unique blend of modern militarism and ancient warrior ethos. By underestimating both Japan's sword and its soul, the United States left itself vulnerable to a blow of stunning force. The final failure was the belief that the enemy would act as they themselves would act, a failure that ensured the dawn of December 7th would not be met with vigilance, but with a surprise that should never have been surprising.